Timothy.
Robert, here we are to talk about one of our favorite things.
Favorite singers.
Singers. How wonderful is that? Well, you know, I'm thinking for me personally, we're meant to give our personal response. Singing was at the core of my musical experience at the very beginning. I was a boy soprano, and I sang and sang and sang from age 4 or 5 until my voice broke, which was a cataclysm, like unbelievable, because singing meant so much to me. And to this day, I fancy, right or wrong, that I know what it feels like, even though I didn't keep singing. And I have this terrific fellow feeling with singers. For me, the greatest thing is the personal expression by the human voice. Now, even a spoken voice can have that effect. I mean, you think of James Earl Jones and that rumbling bass of his, you know, which is so expressive and fantastic and inimitable and instantly recognizable. And to me, a great singing voice is like that. You know it right away. It's characteristic. It's personal. It has a timbre like nothing else, because voices are individual. And what it contains is the expressive value of human experience in every note, in every phrase. And that's what makes, to me, a great voice and a great performer. I was in the car the other day coming home from picking up some groceries. I had to stop and drive onto the side of the road and stop the car because I suddenly found myself weeping, like tears were streaming down my face. And I wasn't even really thinking why that was. It just happened. And what was it? It was the fact that CBC played the song by this 12-year-old, I think his name is Keedron Bryant, to a text that his mother had written. We're living in an era where this has recently happened, the death of this black man in Minneapolis. And this 12-year-old boy recorded a song written to his mother's text that was so incredibly touching, because so genuine, so beautifully produced, and so personal in the sound. And that slayed me. It took me a while to recover from that. And voices affect me that way.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head, as it were. And that's one of the things that people will often refer to when they conjure up, whether it's a mythical one or not, a golden era of singing, is that you can tell within one note who the singer is. And once you've heard that voice, you don't forget it. And all the things you say, I absolutely agree with. I didn't have as long a career as a boy soprano as you did, but I would listen to singing right from the very first time I learned how to operate a record player, because my dad had recordings of wonderful singers.
Sure.
And like you, I was a member of the Christchurch Cathedral Boys Choir. I had been at Fairfield United, but they paid you at Christchurch Cathedral, so I was seduced.
I remember those dimes. Yeah.
10 cents of, yeah, that was real money in the 60s. So all of the singers that I've chosen to discuss are singers who, to me, have instantly recognizable timbres. They all were associated with recital work as well as opera. And one of the other things that singers have is the ability to color your perception of words and poetry. And so that's one of the dazzling reasons why you can listen to 4 or 5 singers sing the same favorite song. And even though they may not do eccentric things with it in terms of timing or rubato or tempo, they still have an instantly recognizable personal response to text as well as to the music. So the first person I'm choosing to talk about, I'm going to say right off the bat that I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce her name correctly. This is the wonderful Catalan soprano Victoria de los Ángeles, who has been a favorite of mine ever since I first heard her sing Andi Musik by Schubert. And it was her practice when she was making her operatic debut in a city to go first and give a recital with a pianist who was very often Gerald Moore, because she felt she could meet her audience on a more intimate and personal level. And of course, even after she stopped singing in the opera house, she continued to do recitals. And there's something incredibly warm and natural and humane about the way she sings and communicates with an audience. You can feel the smile even over the speakers in a recording. And it's no surprise to me that she's also one of the favorite singers of my second singer, but we'll get to that when we get to it. So Victoria de los Ángeles had an amazing career, as you know, and she made her debuts at La Scala and at the Met and at Covent Garden, all in the same year, 1950, when she was 26 27. And the earliest recordings are when she was in her 20s and already sounding like a fully mature, beautiful, natural, unforced voice. It's true, some people say that she had a bit of a tight top. She didn't always get up to the high notes effortlessly. But what she has in compensation for that is an incredibly warm and beautiful middle range. And that's where most of her roles lie. Now, when she made her Covent Garden debut, it was a situation that we would never allow at Pacific Opera. She sang the role of Mimi in La Bohème in Italian, and everyone else sang their roles in English.
Oh, yeah.
Can you imagine anything like that?
Macaronic. I've seen performances in Middle Europe in 3 languages.
That's, I think that's asking people to suspend their disbelief even more than opera should. Also, Victoria de Los Angeles was involved with a now legendary recording conducted by Thomas Beecham of La Bohème. Thomas Beecham of sometimes rather glutinous tempi, but it did have that marvelous pairing of de Los Angeles and Bierling, which has enlivened a few recordings. So if I was going to recommend to anybody an introduction to the art of Victoria de Los Angeles, it would probably be the 1960 performance that is available on YouTube of her singing Si mi chiamano Mimi. And that's what I will point out to on the website. So that would be my favorite singer, number 1. Over to you, Timothy.
Well, it's a wonderful choice, and I completely agree. I have to say, on both of our behalfs, that being asked to choose 5 singers from dozens, if not hundreds, that we've learned to love and appreciate is virtually impossible. I made a rule of thumb that I would only talk about singers I heard in person. So these are all singers that I've experienced, and some of them very considerably. I'm thrilled to death to say that I experienced almost her entire later in life mature repertoire. I'm speaking of the one, and really you can say the only, Brigitte Nielsen, this phenomenon who took the world by storm, and really every singer who ever worked with her always acknowledged that there was only one of her, because she's somebody that developed a technique and had the capacity to make a sound that was simply incredible. She could ride the Vienna Philharmonic like a pony. I mean, it was just unbelievable, the force and power, but also the gleaming beauty of this voice. You talked about De Los Angeles warmth and humane, and so those aren't necessarily the adjectives people generally apply to Brigitte Nielsen singing. But Nielsen singing was phenomenal. She was equal to the enormous challenges of Wagner, the enormous challenges of, say, a Turandot, which, although it's only 16 minutes, is for the singer 16 minutes from hell, and it's supposed to be a voice breaker and wrecker. She could sing right through a storm and make herself heard. In fact, I used to talk to young people who didn't know her and say, you know how bright a lighthouse beam is when you're closer to it? I mean, from a huge distance over the water, you're grateful to see, but when you're close, it's blinding. And when you were in the opera house with Brigitte Nielsen, and she would approach a certain phrase, and if she turned her body and she was facing out and facing straight at you, you felt as if something had pierced you and nailed you to your seat, something you couldn't see, but you could certainly feel. It was unbelievable, the focus, the tone, the brilliance, and she could summon it like that. There was no warming up. She just could do it. There's a moment I want to put on the list for you to listen to, and that is in the 3rd act of Siegfried, when Siegfried wakes her up with a kiss, the old motif from fairy stories, and then she wakes up and sees him, and they fall in love, and they have this music, and she's recalling something. Now she's immortal, having been, a divine critter. And she sings this joyous love, rapturous love. I mean, it gets so rapturous that at the end, George Bernard Shaw, of all people, said they get so involved, so wrapped up, so intense, so erotic, that George Bernard Shaw said, we're very glad that the curtain comes down when it does. Just in time, I think, was his expression. So there's a passage there where she has to sing a long extended phrase, and then bang, the entry is on a high C. We're not talking building up. We're not talking singing a scale. We're not talking about getting there stepwise. She has to come sailing in with it. And it's in the middle of a big orchestral phrase, and it's just stunning. And I don't know anybody. And I've listened to Rings, and I've heard of many performances of Rings, and I've heard a dozen, Brunhildes. I've never heard anyone tackle that particular entry. And it goes for everything else, of course. Her immolation scene, amazing and wonderful. And she had this sustained power. I know for a fact, personally, that she had a great sense of humor. I was at a couple of parties when I was a student in Vienna. She could hold her own at the drinking table, let me tell you. It was amazing. People were falling about, and there was Birgit pouring herself another shot, and it was just, she was an amazing woman. She was a phenom. She was extraordinary. And she really isn't in a category. She may have had some early history with Flagstad, a fellow Scandinavian. Flagstad, of course, was Norwegian, and Nielsen was Swedish. And there is that kind of line and tradition. But whereas Flagstad had the warmth and humanity that you talk about, as well as the epic scale, she did tend to sing a little bit flat and wasn't always as brilliant, especially in the upper register. Sorry, I've gone on at some length, but Nielsen...
Nielsen deserves it.
Yeah.
Now we're moving to quite a different singer when I approach the second name on my list. And this is a person who had an operatic career restricted to the British Isles. That was by her own choice. She was invited many times to sing at other houses, but she felt that she could do the art its most, she could be most faithful to it by imposing some of these limitations on herself. And I'm speaking of Dame Janet Baker. And I think I would have to say she's one of my favorite musicians, period, of any time. And her operatic repertoire was actually quite wide. It didn't have a large number of roles, but it did encompass Monteverdi, Handel, Purcell, which would be the excerpt I would want you to hear, Mozart, Verdi, and Britain, of course, but also Donizetti. Some of the fireworks of Maria Stuarda were certainly easily within her grasp. And of course, Dido and Les Troyens of Berlioz. So it was an outstanding artist, Dame Janet Baker. And again, to me, what probably encapsulates her and makes her so close to me the most is her recordings of Mahler's Rückert Lieder with Sir John Barbarelli and the Halle Orchestra. I heard her sing Mahler live. She's one person I did hear live too. And her intelligence with text is unbelievable. When we spoke about our favorite operas, I mentioned having heard Jon Vickers sing the role of Peter Grimes, and you could understand and hear every single solitary consonant and vowel. And the same was true of Dame Janet when she sang in English. And just her characterization and her warmth of spirit and her humanity, I think, are what touched me about her the most. And again, that incredibly distinctive timbre of her voice. And I think I probably, when I listen to female singers, respond even more to the middle range than I do to the top, that luscious middle range that she had. Now, one time she was asked about her favorite singers, and unsurprisingly, the first name was Kathleen Ferriers. She had been in real influence. The next one will probably be not all that familiar to our audience, is Dame Isabel Bailey, who coined a great phrase when talking about the aesthetics of teaching singing. She advised all her students, never sing louder than lovely, which is not a bad thing to remember. But the third one was Victoria de Los Angeles, who she thought of as just a ray of sunlight coming into the British Isles, which we both know could use rays of sunlight from time to time. So I would, as I said, recommend above all, in terms of opera, the early 1960s recording of Dido, Purcell's Dido, and The Great Lament, When I Am Laid in Earth, as an example of the wonderful Dame Janet Baker. Timothy, over to you.
Well, a contemporary mezzo with whom I fell in love when I very first heard her as a student in Vienna in 1966, I think. And that is the inimitable, wonderful, and still with us, mezzo-soprano Christa Ludwig. I'd always assumed Christa was Austrian, but of course she's German. She was born in Germany, but the Vienna Staatsoper became so much her home base. I mean, she sang her whole repertoire there, and she was spectacular. This is a woman who had a plushness in her voice, an incredible, almost erotic feeling of depth and warmth, and there was such a velvet, and everybody talks about velvet, and often when I refer to velvet, it's usually when I hear some young singer who hasn't got it yet, and I say, sounds like a mouse pissing on velvet. No, Christa Ludwig had velvet, and it's a voice that just, or deep dark chocolate or something. I'm trying to find an analogy, but you just have to listen to it to get that message. And it's always feelingful, always soulful, always incredibly musicianly, always on pitch. I mean, I saw so much of her repertoire. She was so affecting. And of course, she learned from her mom. Her mom was a main teacher. And she had this spectacular technique and sostenuto kind of. Her legatos were unbelievable. She did have a short period when she went into soprano repertoire. And there is a glorious, I'm so glad it was recorded, the glorious recording of Fidelio with Klemperer and Vickers. And it's just stunning. And it's a terrific document to have in terms of the interpretation of the piece. But for her sake, I'm glad she backed off a little bit, because sustained for a long period, it would have been more strain than she could maintain. And she understood that and stopped doing it. But I did have the great privilege of hearing both her last Octavian and Rosenkavalier and her first Marschallin. Of course, she'd been an Octavian to many famous Marschallins, but then I guess she just got fed up and said, well, I'm going to sing this myself, and did. Marschallin, of course, is a woman of extraordinary poise and grace and so on and so forth. And while Christa Ludwig is beautiful and endearing and all of that, I don't know whether that level of poise and grace is something that she always attained, but she's fantastic and just wonderful. And of course, you, Robert, you know her personally from having played for her in masterclass or in lessons. And you know her humor, and you know her there's an earthiness of the best kind, a groundedness, a down-to-earthness is what I want to say about her. But the voice is sublime. It is one of the greatest things, just the sound. I mean, I completely understand your infatuation with Janet Baker. And the only thing that maybe holds me back is I've heard from so many people that she was a cow to work with. But that doesn't matter. It's what the art is, and it's what comes across, and it's what the artist brings. And I absolutely acknowledge Janet Baker, and it takes nothing away from the fact that I think Christa Ludwig's voice was one of the most beautiful in her generation.
Without doubt.
I did say something. I got to tell you this. She was giving an interview one time. It was in German in Vienna. And she was asked by the interviewer, she said, "Ja, Frau Ludwig, you have become such a very well-known interpreter of Gustav Mahler. Is this because of Leonard Bernstein, who loves you?" And of course, Ludwig had recorded with Klemperer a lot of Mahler already. And she said, right there in the interview, she said, "Ja, Mahler, I don't know." She said, "I must have a kitschy soul." Ich muss eine kitschige Seele haben. She said it.
I can't say that I know Christa Ludwig. I played for lessons that she gave to Susan Plass, who sung with POV now several times. And so that entitled me to have lunch with Madame Ludwig.
There you go.
And she was very, very funny, very amusing, and probably in the most matter-of-fact way, one of the people who would agree that, yes, she did have one of the most beautiful voices. She acknowledged that it was a gift, and then she took care of it. But she said, yeah, I had the most beautiful voice, so I won the competition.
Robert, she's 92.
I know.
And she just published a book, like within, I don't know.
I have that. I was going to say that about her. Her autobiography, her memoir, is 177% worth reading, and it's so funny, but at the same time very down to earth, very serious, very informative. Now, I will say in defense of Dame Janet that I've heard from some people
You don't need to.
She's a dear to work with.
Okay.
So, but I've heard the same as you. But who knows? In any case, the next person I'd like to talk about is, well, I'll tell you a little bit of background about me and my infatuation with this singer. My father had recordings, as I've told you before, and that's how I became introduced too many singers. Some of them were some of those like really squealy high singers. Erna Sack, does that name?
Oh,
Milica Corgis, but there was one Christmas album in particular. I don't think that Herbert von Karajan ever did anything like this with any other singer, but he did make a sort of Christmas hits album with the one and only Leontyne Price. So that was my first exposure to Miss Price. She did sing in Vancouver. She did recitals, and people who met her backstage said she was a real doll, funny, humorous, down to earth, those things that we kind of like when we meet people. But she was as regal as any monarch when she was portraying a Verdi heroine. And to me, I love her singing Strauss. I love her singing the songs of Ned Rorem or Lee Hoybe. She was a really terrific recitalist, and of course, one of the supreme barber interpreters. But above all, to me, she's Verdi. In my lifetime, that's the Verdi sound for the roles of the Leonoras, Aida, and that her ability, again, to conjure up this incredible line that she had. You mentioned legato with Madame Ludwig. Price had that too. And the amplitude of sound is so extraordinary. And it sort of set a standard in my lifetime in listening to recordings for what those great Verdi roles needed. And it's true that perhaps not always was she the detailed actress that some great opera singers are, but it kind of didn't matter. Just the length of the line, the amplitude of sound, the beauty of her poise on stage. I think she was incredibly remarkable. My first Verdi opera as a repetiteur was Ballo in '92. And so she was one of the great Amelias in that. But if I were to choose one thing to introduce people to Leontyne Price outside of that Christmas album, it would have to be the arias of Leonora from Trovatore. I think she completely owned that role. And when somebody asked Zinka Milanov, what do you need to produce Il Trovatore of Verdi? She said, oh, it's actually very easy. You just need the 4 greatest singers in the world. And when Leontyne Price came on the scene, we found out.
That's beautiful. What a great singer. What a wonderful singer. And what a wonderful range of repertoire, as you say, she picked up and was so strong in. Absolutely wonderful. Well, here comes a tenor. And it would be churlish, given our Canadian context, not to think of a great Canadian tenor. And I was so lucky, again, to see almost his entire repertoire, because it wasn't huge. Mature repertoire. I speak, of course, of Jon Vickers, who is one of the great Wagnerians in a long tradition of Wagnerians. And since then, we've had another great Wagnerian in the person of Ben Heppner. But Jon Vickers had something very special. And it's interesting because when you talk about favorite singers, and I talked about what I meant about the voice and the beauty of the voice and so on and so forth, it wasn't necessarily the obvious, beautiful voice, Vickers. It was just extremely intense and expressive in a way that you couldn't, you know how you say you look away from something when it gets too much? You can't listen away because you can't close your ears, and it's so overwhelming. And this was what was incredible about Vickers. He had an intensity to him, and he had an incredible integrity. And the way he would portray things, he was so focused and so completely devoted to making whatever it was real. And these things were unreal. Tristan, for example, it's long. You're on stage, I don't know, by the hour. I mean, in Act 2, you've got a duet. This duet, the Tristan duet, is longer than some marriages, for God's sake. And then in Act 3, when you think he gets a chance to rest and lie down, no, he's got this huge, long scene when he's waiting for Isolde to arrive and he's with his henchman, thing. And he sings and he sings and he sings. And then she arrives and then he has to sing some more. And it's just unbelievable. Vickers could carry this kind of character right through a long span of opera and keep you riveted. Riveted, not just vocally, but riveted to his physical presence. He wasn't a tall man, but he was square. He was extremely strong. He suggests something titanic and something epic. I've never seen anybody be able to project, okay, this is a man being whomever, let's take Tristan as an example. Or let's take some of the other characters, you know, he never sang Siegfried because I think he understood, but he sang, you know, some of these things with such strength and power and such a compelling epic quality. It was the epic quality in his delivery that was amazing. Now, I did meet him a couple times, and I remember the first time I was warned by friends who knew him, when you meet him, put your hand out, and then when he puts his out, you grab and go deep and hard. You squeeze as hard as you can. And I thought they're joking for sure, you know. So I did meet him, introduce, hello, this is so, and I could see the hand coming at me. So I did. I went, and his was like a baseball mitt. It was a big, big hand, strong. And I dove in with my hand and I squeezed as hard as I could. And I looked him right in the eye, which was the other factor. And after about a minute of agony, because he squeezed too, it was like, and then I realized I'd passed the test and he was fine and we chatted just like whatever, you know. But that was fascinating. I remember that about him. Another anecdote I remember that went the rounds in Vienna at the time was he was singing José with Christa Ludwig in London. And he got so intense with her on stage that he grabbed her and one of her bracelets snapped and went digging right into her arm, and she started to pulse bleed out of her forearm, and it was terrible. They had to bandage up and do something, I don't know what. But he would get so carried away. He would get so intense on stage that, you know, colleagues would warn each other about him and say, you know, be careful. But such devotion, such strength, such focus, and this incredible power, this thing that came out of his body like a beam, like a whale almost, you know. Extraordinary and inimitable and instantly recognizable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the stories that Christa Ludwig told us around the lunch table in Ravinia all those years ago had to do with that episode of singing Carmen with Vickers. She really liked him. She thought he was a fantastic colleague. But she did mention that he drew blood during one performance, but her only qualm about it, the only thing that made her complain was, he didn't even send flowers.
He probably expected them.
Yeah, maybe he did. So that's, we're going to look at another singer I have met and been to her home, but again, that's only because she was a teacher of Susan Platt's. And so I went and played for lessons, and I think this woman would have been a great, great, great teacher. And I will also mention one of my own criteria is that I'm not mentioning any of my favorite singers who I've worked with, because I thought I'd just stick with the ones that I either only just met or didn't even meet. So I met Jessye Norman, and I had been infatuated with her at first for the same reason so many other people are, just because of the sheer size of her voice and just the amplitude. It was like a concrete architectural thing in the room with you. And the soaring line that comes after the violin solo in Beim Schlafengehen of Richard Strauss from the Four Last Songs is just incredible. And you get the feeling, and you always had this with Vickers as well, is that there's like 60% more voice that could come out if she felt like it. But that's not a reason to fall in love with the singer's art. I think you can. That's a phenomenon, and it was very definitely there. Another thing that you hear about both of these singers, Vickers and Jessye Norman, these larger-than-life personalities, is how incredibly effective they can be on an operatic stage when they sing quietly. And Jessye Norman and Jon Vickers had incredible pianissimi, intense. It's like when people say stage whispers are, that's when you have to be at your most controlled, your most intense. And you really, really heard that at the beginning of the Liebestod, for example, when Jessye Norman sort of wafts in, when Herbert von Karajan, they make eye contact, and she comes out of the orchestra like a vapor and then builds and builds and builds. And she is probably my favorite Ariadne for the same reason as I mentioned about Leontyne Price. The line. It's not so much that you, again, want to be impressed by how long a singer can sing without taking a breath. That's an acrobatic feat, and it loses its ability to impress very quickly. It's just when you get completely taken from the beginning of the phrase to the end, you're in the hands of somebody like Norman, like Vickers, like Ludwig. You just have this incredible feeling of being enveloped in the music. Now, Jessye Norman also had an very interesting repertoire. And for somebody who really literally became a superstar in an almost pop music sense, in my personal opinion, she shouldn't have done all those crossover records. But that's just my personal opinion. I don't always like the sound of the diction of classical singers singing popular music. It sounds too refined. But her repertoire for someone who was a superstar included Berg and Schoenberg, included Janáček, included some really interesting composers that she managed to make her own. But Jessye Norman, who needs certainly no advocacy from me, if I was to give a suggestion for one superlative recording outside of Ariadne auf Naxos, I would definitely go to YouTube and listen to her performance of the Liebestod with Karajan. It's a concert performance rather than an operatic one. And she had a very interesting experience with him. She said that when she went to the first rehearsal, he had her sit in the middle of the orchestra and not sing anything, just listen to the orchestra. Which I think is a very interesting way to approach working with a singer who's certainly as established as that. But she became a member of that orchestra as well as the soloist. Anyway, I love that performance and I love that work. So that's.
You remind me of a thing I forgot, because since you mentioned Karajan, I can't help it. I have to tell this story. Karajan started the Osterfestspiele, Easter Festival in Salzburg, essentially because the Wagners wouldn't let him come and direct as well as conduct in Bayreuth. So he started the Osterfestspiele to do his own ring. And he directed it, and he conducted it, and he lit it. So he did his own lighting. So, of course, there were a lot of jokes made about all this. And he was doing Tristan und Isolde. And the second act, we already talked about that, where it gets, you know, the beautiful, it's unbelievable. And he brought the Berlin Philharmonic, which is another affront. And so there they are playing, and he's got Brigitte Nielsen, and I've forgotten who the tenor was. Maybe it was James King. Anyway, he had it lit, this beautiful big golden tree overarching, and they were on a bench under the tree, and it gets darker and it gets darker and it gets darker, and you have to sort of really peer through the gloom, because what he was doing was turning it into a concert with, you know, focused on the music and sort of getting away from having to figure out how to stage anything sexual, you know. So it got darker and darker, and then there came the famous day when there was a rehearsal. The dress rehearsal, one of the dress rehearsals, they got to this dark passage, went darker and darker, and all of a sudden, boom, the place was lit up, and Karajan was seen from the back in absolute silhouette with his arms in the air. What had happened? Brigitte Nielsen brought on a miner's helmet with one of those really powerful beams, shone it right down into the pit at Karajan. And of course, it was consternation everywhere. It was awful. It interrupted the rehearsal, which was, of course, you know, unforgivable sin. Nielsen never sang with him again. It was like, that was it.
Yeah. Both she and Christa Ludwig had some things to say about Karajan's direct and light. I think one of them was to the effect that he required, and some ridiculous number of rehearsals just for lighting, and Ludwig said he didn't know what he was doing.
Well, it's not only that, they had a cartoon about that, where two guys in the Vienna Staatsoper in Vienna are reading the paper where it says Karajan, you know, doing this and lighting. And one of them turns to the other and says, "Are you kidding me? I could get it that dark in 10 minutes. So, I mean, but can you imagine a cartoon about that in a Canadian newspaper? I mean, hello.
Someday.
So I guess it's my turn.
It is.
I'm not leaving the tenor realm, and I'm saying again that I've chosen only the people that I heard live. Otherwise, there'd be other people on this list, one of them being, of course, Björling, whose voice was as close to sunshine and liquid gold as you could possibly imagine. However, I did hear the great and tragically, in his life, truncated Fritz Wunderlich.
I'm jealous.
All the Mozarts, and I heard him sing operetta, and I heard him sing, he was fantastic. Now, he was he had an absolutely gorgeous, effortless timbre all through his voice, up and down. And it seemed to be, because not everybody has that. Not even every great singer has that. That there's this seamlessness to his sound, up and down. He sang in 2 or 3 different languages. His German, though, is pretty fantastic. And it has a warmth, and it has a shine, and it has a vigor, and it has a masculinity that is tempered. It's not muscular. It's just very strong. I'll give you an example. So Don Ottavio and Don Giovanni, we talked about this before. Most of the time, the so-called Mozart tenors tended to be little guys compared to their Donna Annas, who tend to be big sopranos. And you always had the feeling that Donna Anna can pick him up with a scruff, give him a shake, and, you know, but not Wunderlich. He wasn't big, but he was manly in every way, in an elegant way. And it was so compelling when he sang it that you realized, I saw it often with the great Cesare Siepi as Don Giovanni, and Wunderlich was like the true antipode, the true North Pole to the South Pole of the Giovanni, which doesn't always happen. I mean, you understood how she could fall in love with him, and in the end didn't understand why she told him to go away for a year, because she... So Fritz Wunderlich, he sang Lieder, he sang all this classical repertoire. There's, thank God, so many wonderful recordings of his. And the one that I'd like to put on the list, if I can find it for you, is a piece, a ballad called the Rattenfänger, the rat catcher. It's, I think, 3 or 4 verses. He tells a sort of life story of this guy whose fate it was to become the rat catcher. And it's orchestrated, I think, from an original piano version so beautifully and played. It's so romantic, and the atmosphere in the orchestra is incredible. And his attunedness to the nuance and it's a ballad, so it's a story, and his way of telling the story and taking you through a whole short version of a life is really compelling, and I found it always uplifting, and I just love this piece, and nobody's ever heard it. So I'm going to try to find it and put it on our list. Fritz Wunderlich.
I'll look forward to that very much. I'm a huge fan of his as well. And I'm choosing another tenor for my final choice. And to me, this illustrates a dictum about what makes a great singer. That's different from what makes a great voice. And there are certainly people with outstanding voices who somehow don't reach the upper echelons of singing in terms of their communicativeness. I think it may have to do with inadequacy of diction. I think very often it has to do with a personality that loves singing but doesn't necessarily love music. And one must have all of those things. So the next person is very rarely mentioned when we think of beautiful voices, but I think in the repertoire that was right for him, he's an outstanding vocal interpreter, and that's Sir Peter Pears. And as one of my all-time favorite desert island opera composers is his partner, Sir Benjamin Britten, or he wasn't ever Sir, just Benjamin Britten. It's always interesting, no matter who you've heard, whether it's Jon Vickers or Philip Langridge, any number of the really first-rate people that sing those Britten tenor roles, to go back and hear Pears interpret them. And there are things that you can itemize, like diction, for example, incredible breath control. Kathleen Ferrier was always very envious of his legato. All of these things are techniques that are a means to an end, but somehow he manages to become these characters, and he becomes them in operatic drama. It's not that he's compensating for anything by acting. Sometimes we see these singers who perhaps are past their prime, and they overcompensate for vocal weaknesses or wear and tear with sort of hammy histrionics. And I don't think Pears ever did that. And certainly in any of the videos I've seen, in any of the recordings I've seen, he's an outstanding example of every Britten role he created, from Albert Herring, who he would have been almost twice too old for, to Peter Quint, to both Lysander and Flute in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Captain Vere and Billy Budd, but above all, Peter Grimes I think he's the most incredible Peter Grimes. I never saw him live, of course, but I did see Vickers, who was also an incredible Peter Grimes. And those are the two that usually come up when you're talking about making comparisons. Now, Pears also was a very fine recitalist. Again, I think primarily singing Benjamin Britten's songs. There are those people who recommend his Winterreise. I'm not one of them, although I love hearing Benjamin Britten play Schubert piano parts. To me, it's really on the operatic stage that Pears is outstanding, and above all for that Peter Grimes. And you can catch as an excerpt the mad scene from the second scene of Act 3, which I'll put up on YouTube for you if you're interested in going to watch it. One of my teachers as a collaborative pianist was Mrs. Gwendolyn Williams Koldovsky, who had been an accompanist for Lotte Lehmann. She was Madame Lehmann's West Coast accompanist, and Paul Ulanowski was her East Coast one. And Mrs. Koldovsky always recommended, among other singers, Peter Pears for his for his artistry. And she said she played a recording of him for one of her classes in California, and some young girl said, "Well, I don't like his voice." And Mrs. Koldovsky, I'll never forget this, said, "I just could have slapped her." But there is an example of something that he brings so much to the art of creating an operatic character. So he's always been a favorite of mine.
No, I completely support. I think what a great artist, you know. I think a couple of things just came to mind as you were talking. I mean, he always, apparently he said, he always tried to push Benjamin Britten into practicing more piano, because he felt while there were things about his music that weren't maybe getting through everywhere, he felt that Benjamin Britten could have been a world-class household name pianist if he concentrated on that. But of course, Britten had more important things to do. Oh, sorry, didn't mean. No, and I think about this, you know, yes, it's a very particular voice. It's a very particular voice. It's not, you know, you can't name three of that. There's this, it's the one thing. And it's absolutely true. But I often think to myself, how fortunate we are that Benjamin Britten fell in love with this wonderful tenor, and that was their life partnership. I mean, I think to myself, my God, what might have happened if he fell in love with a violist, for example? Oh, now we're going to get mail. But anyway, you know what I mean.
Well, he kind of did write some first-rate viola music.
Of course, it was a joke.
I don't know that he fell in love with any of the violists.
No, I don't think so. So finally, I guess we're down to that. So since an early age, my mother loved music, and she loved particularly lieder. And so she had quite a collection of lieder singers, even going back to 78s. There are a few people probably watching who even remember those. So one of the voices that stuck with me from a very early age was somebody who, now that his life is over, has been termed one of the handful of great musicians of the last century, the 20th century. And I am referring to Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Fischer-Dieskau started singing very early. You can hear Schöne Müllerin. He's 23 or 24 years old. He's still in the German army, you know, who's at that stage. But he came out and began very quickly developing both vocally, repertoire. This was a consummate artist at his very finest. His standard, not only did he have a not necessarily entirely remarkable voice, it was very beautiful within its range and very expressive. And few singers can even begin to approach him with the consistency with which he treats texts. It doesn't matter the language. He sings French exquisitely. His Italian is stunning. His English, phenomenal. I mean, he's on that recording, Britten conducting the War Requiem. And when he sings some of those quasi-recit things, you know, from Wilfred Owen, they're just heart-wrenching because he understands the value of every consonant and the color of every vowel. And it's not fussy. It's subsumed in this beautiful line and an understanding of where it's going and what it should express. Yes, in later years, the voice didn't last. The lighter voices tend to go first. As a little footnote in vocal history, I mean, I heard Hans Hotter in his 70s still singing, and it wasn't perfect, but you could see the outline of this enormous voice that had been there for all those years. Fischer-Dieskau retired fairly promptly. He lived the last few years. He made some recordings of interesting things where he could, for example, speak the text, because both Strauss wrote, I think, 2 or 3 monodramas for spoken voice and piano, and he recorded those, and they're treasures, you know, because his understanding of text. He wrote a couple of books. He wrote one about Nietzsche and Wagner, which is absolutely worth reading in my view. He also wrote a book about leader and the text and the choice of text and all of these things so important. And by his singing, he recorded everything. He recorded basically everything everybody ever wrote. It feels like that because all the Schubert songs, all the Schumann songs, all the Wolf songs, I mean, it's just Brahms. Oh my gosh, it's huge repertoire, but with the same degree of attention and care and detail and line at the same time. It's an immersive experience. The idea of Innerlichkeit, interiority, which is the whole characteristic of the German song, the Lied, the expression of the inner life, he brings so in an unparalleled way, in my particular view of this. And for so long a period, over so many composers and so much text but I remember there were some shocking things too. I remember seeing him in a recording session. I was in the outer room in the recording session. And I looked aghast because he was recording with a pianist and he had 3, count them, ashtrays because he was smoking between takes. And the ashtrays were like little piles of ashes. And he just would wander around. I remember when he had a cigarette in each of the ashtrays on the go. This just, I mean, we think of that. I mean, oh my God, he lived to be what, 87?
Yeah, well, some people have all the luck.
That's a good way of looking at it. But I think he's one of the great performers. And I think his life and his music making was a particular gift to the world. He more or less brought the idea of the Lied and the recital and everything back. It was in the 19th century a thing to do, Hausmusik. I mean, that's how Schubert sang his own songs and brought, people to his home and did these parties and presented his works. Fischer-Dieskau brought the Lied back into a central position in musical life in the 20th century and exemplified it. Of course, he sang in opera too. He was a terrific actor. He didn't have, as I said, the range of the voice wasn't extreme. So that, he did a whole bunch of things that you would be surprised. I mean, recorded Falstaff with Leonard Bernstein. He had operas written for him, like Adalbert Riemann's great King Lear, written for Fischer-Dieskau, knowing exactly how and what he could do. So he was a major force, a major force. And I think kind of nothing is ever eclipsed that has value. But he is his shadow is very broad over the 20th century and its idea of music and what he brought to it.
And actually, he influenced quite a few singers on our lists and worked with them. They were all huge fans of Fischer-Dieskau. Yep. And one of the great tributes I remember reading was from Ned Rorem, who can be a bit viperish. But he pointed out, Ned Rorem did, and I think this is, as an American composer of song, it was very telling that at that point he said, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau is more prepared to sing a program of American song tomorrow than any living American singer.
Well, I mean, I understand that it cuts a different way too, and that's very Ned Rorem.
Well, yes, but it was, I think, it was a tribute to how observant Ned Rorem is, although I think Leontyne Price could have done a recital of American song.
Oh, he did. He recorded them. I mean, yeah.
But Fischer-Dieskau's repertoire was probably the most far-ranging of any of the singers we've mentioned. And I used to have a recording, I don't know where it went, of him singing Tosca. He sings Scarpia, of course, with Nielsen as Tosca. Not the cast you'd expect, although Corelli.
No, not at all. I can I mention one last thing?
Yes.
Which is maybe something I'll put on. We all have those moments that we remember from our musical experience. And one of the magic moments for me, one of the moments of kind of spiritual devastation for me was listening to the dress rehearsal of Das Lied von der Erde in Vienna with James King and Fischer-Dieskau and Leonard Bernstein conducting. Now, Bernstein had brought Mahler back to Vienna. When I arrived there at 18, I was so full of Mahler in my head that I was almost ready to fall on my knees if anybody mentioned his name. And of course, he didn't exist because since 38, 39, there was no Mahler in Vienna. So Bernstein, having done the recording in New York brought Mahler to Vienna, basically. Yes, there have been individual performances. There was a ninth here and a fourth there and a couple of lieder here, but he wasn't part of the repertoire. And Bernstein made him that indelibly. But this recording was so extraordinary because the Vienna Philharmonic, great, great orchestra, though it is and always has been, was not particularly virtuosic. And Bernstein came from an American tradition where everything was like this. So he pushed the orchestra, sometimes a little bit beyond. There are even tapes of him chastising them. There's a thing where he says at one point, rehearsing, I think, the fifth, to the Vienna Philharmonic, he says, Meine Herren, so kann man kein Mahler spielen. And he says it in German right to them, which is, you can't play Mahler like this. So anyway, here's the recording, the dress rehearsal before the performances and then the recordings, which I also went to. But the dress rehearsal at the end of Das Lied von der Erde, if you know it, these 6 songs, the one is called Der Abschied, the farewell. And the very end of it is linked to the 9th century, the 9th Symphony of Mahler too. It has some of that same dissolution. It kind of dissolves sonically into, it floats away into a horizon that we can only imagine. And he sings ewig, ewig many times at the end on just a little falling 2 notes. Ewig, ewig, and it gets quieter and quieter. And those little 2 notes are a gesture from the Renaissance, a sigh. And this goes and goes and goes, and then it goes away, it gets quieter and quieter, and at the very end, there's this little glitter of just on a little chord before it's all over, and then fades entirely into silence. Fischer-Dieskau delivered this with such perfection in the Musikverein, which has a great acoustic, and it was so transfixing to hear that get quieter and quieter and quieter and still be present until at the very end. Even the Vienna Philharmonic, who are as hard bitten as any other professional orchestra. It's not, they're not, I'm not being sentimental about them at all, but they sat stunned by what they had heard right in front of them and experienced and participated in, until of course Leonard Bernstein starts jumping around and kissing everybody, which is what he did. But that moment at the end of that is something I will never forget. I will never forget the focus and the incredible musical technical accomplishment of those last Ewigs from Fischer-Dieskau. It's not the same on the recording, which is a bit wonky and in places even out of tune from the orchestra because it's hard and Bernstein drove them, you know. But to me, in some ways, even though it is wonky, it is the most expressive version of that great, great composition, Das Lied von der Erde, which I think is Mahler's pinnacle achievement, if one can say those things, and certainly one of the greatest pieces ever written in our Western tradition. I say that straight out.
Good. What a wonderful way to end this little presentation. I'm going to hunt that down. Thank you so much, Timothy.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. It's always fun.
Always fun indeed. We'll look forward to the next time, and thank you all out there for spending part of your day with us. Bye for now.
Please don't write and complain that we didn't talk about Maria Callas, okay? Because we love her.
We love her. We love many singers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.